The cry of a wounded soldier pierced the deafening roar of explosions, and Captain Sarah Miller, her hands busy with rescue, darted towards him, ignoring the whistling bullets flying dangerously close to her head. Time slowed as her hands, guided not by textbooks but by years of harsh experience, began to perform the impossible, binding severe bleeding with bandages that just a moment ago had been part of her own uniform. She could hear her own racing pulse in her ears, mixed with distant cries, the smell of gunpowder and iron, as she set to work, her focus absolute and her determination unwavering. Those seconds, those minutes in the Snake Canyon on April 17th, 2011, forever etched in her understanding. Life hangs by a thread, and she is the only barrier between death and hope. She remembered Private Smith lying there, his face pale, blood pouring heavily from a wound in his neck. Round them, the ground shook from mortar explosions, and the moans of the wounded blended with the crack of gunfire. Sarah did not think. She acted. Her fingers, trembling yet incredibly precise, found the artery. She tore the sleeve of her uniform, twisted it into a tourniquet, and pressed it against the wound, feeling the moisture seep into the fabric. "Hang in there, Smith," she whispered, though the sound of her voice drowned in the chaos. He looked at her with unseeing eyes, but she saw a tiny spark of hope in them. Then there was Sergeant Johnson, pinned under debris, with a severe leg injury. Sarah worked quickly, using a shard of metal plate from a bulletproof vest as a splint, securing it with straps torn from backpacks. She felt the dust and sand getting into her teeth, sweat pouring into her eyes, but she did not stop. Every breath, every movement was directed towards saving lives. She knew reinforcements would not come quickly, and every wounded soldier depended solely on her. Fear was there, of course, it was always present, but it was drowned out by the sharp, fiery determination that burned in her chest. She was alone, but not broken. The morning sun beat down mercilessly over Eagle's Nest, Arizona, casting long shadows on the desert landscape as Sarah Miller drove her battered pickup towards Fort Redemption. The radio crackled with country music and static, but she kept the volume low, preferring the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the familiar weight of silence that had become her companion over the past 3 years. At 42, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the worst the world could offer and somehow managed to keep moving forward. Her hands, scarred and tough, gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the last stretch of highway leading to the base. The landscape here consisted of dust and scrub, interrupted by the occasional mesquite tree that had somehow taken root in the relentless soil. It reminded her of other places, hotter places, where stakes were measured in heartbeats and the margin for error was non-existent. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing faded cargo pants that had accompanied her through countless training sessions and field operations. The fabric was soft from years of washing, the colors muted by the sun and time, but every crease and faded mark told a story. Her combat boots, resoled twice but still sturdy, bore the marks of 1,000 miles walked in service to something greater than herself. She wore no insignia, no unit patches. They belonged to her past, neatly folded in a trunk that had not been opened for months. The invitation to return to Fort Redemption had come through official channels, signed by Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez and approved by Colonel Daniel Hayes himself. The Army needed experienced medics to assist in advanced trauma training for a new generation of combat medics, and somehow Sarah's name had surfaced from the depths of personnel files that most people thought were forever sealed. She hesitated for several weeks before agreeing, knowing that returning to any military base would require her to navigate the complex landscape of active duty protocols while maintaining her civilian status. Deep down, she knew she was returning not for recognition, but for the opportunity to pass on the lessons that had cost her so dearly. Her father, a former soldier now lying in a hospital after a severe injury sustained in service, was a constant reminder of the price soldiers pay. She returned so that no one else would have to go through what he had endured. As the gates of Fort Redemption came into view, Sarah felt the familiar weight in her chest that always accompanied her return to military installations. The guards at the checkpoint were young, likely born after she had already been deployed to her first combat zone. They meticulously checked her civilian contractor documents, like soldiers who took their duties seriously, but she saw the questions in their eyes as they noticed the contrast between her professional demeanor and her civilian status. The base itself sprawled across several hundred acres of Arizona prairie, a complex of low buildings and training facilities designed to prepare soldiers for the realities of modern warfare. Sarah had been here before, many years ago, when it was still under construction, and dreams of what it could become were still forming in the minds of planners and architects. Now it stood as a testament to the military's commitment to excellence in training, with modern medical facilities and simulation centers capable of replicating any combat scenario. She parked her truck in the visitors area, noting the neat rows of government vehicles and personal cars that spoke of the orderly life of the military community. A group of young soldiers ran past in formation, their steps echoing off the concrete buildings as their sergeant shouted instructions. Sarah watched them for a moment, recalling her own days as a young medic learning to balance the demands of military discipline with the responsibility of life and death in field medicine. The administrative building where she needed to register was a modern structure of steel and glass, designed to convey efficiency and authority. Sarah approached the main entrance with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, her documents neatly folded in a folder she carried in her free hand. The automatic doors slid open silently, releasing a wave of cool air that immediately provided relief from the Arizona heat. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the controlled activity of a military administrative center. Soldiers in immaculate uniforms moved purposefully between offices, their conversations conducted in clipped, professional tones that Sarah remembered from her own service. Behind the main desk, a young specialist worked at a computer terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he processed an endless stream of documents that kept the base functioning. Sarah approached the desk and placed her folder on the counter, patiently waiting for the specialist to acknowledge her. When he looked up, she caught a brief flash of assessment that every service member learned to perform automatically: age, posture, purpose. She was clearly older than most visitors, but there was something in her posture that spoke of familiarity with military protocols. "I'm Sarah Miller," she said, her voice carrying the clear diction of someone accustomed to being heard and understood. "I have an appointment with Sergeant Major Rodriguez regarding the medical training contract." The specialist, whose nameplate read Reed, opened her file on his computer and began the verification process. As he worked, Sarah noticed other eyes in the lobby studying her with varying degrees of curiosity. A group of junior officers stood by the bulletin board, their conversation halting as they noticed her presence. She caught snippets of their discussion, speculations about contractors, questions about qualifications, a kind of professional curiosity that was natural in a military environment. "Ma'am, I see your assignment has been confirmed," Specialist Reed said, shifting his gaze from the screen to Sarah's ID. "However, I need to address the issue of your uniform. Basic policy requires that only active personnel wear military uniforms on the premises. I need you to change into civilian clothes before we continue the meeting." Sarah felt a barely perceptible shift in the room's atmosphere as the chatter quieted and attention focused on the exchange at the counter. She glanced down at her faded field pants, understanding the rule, but also aware of the awkward position it created. These were not dress or ceremonial uniforms. This was practical field attire that she had chosen for its familiarity and comfort during what promised to be a physically demanding training assignment. "I understand the rule," Sarah replied evenly. "I brought civilian clothes with me just in case. Is there a place where I can change?" Before Specialist Reed could respond, Lieutenant Mark Jensen stepped forward from where he had been observing the exchange at the officer's bulletin board. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with the clear posture of someone who took rules seriously and expected the same from others. His uniform was impeccable, every detail perfect, and he carried himself with the confidence of an officer who felt comfortable wielding authority. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Jensen," he said, his tone polite but firm. "While I appreciate your understanding of the rule, I need to resolve this matter immediately. Basic policy clearly defines unauthorized uniform wear, and I cannot allow you to proceed further on the premises while violating it." Sarah nodded, acknowledging both the lieutenant's authority and his duty to uphold basic rules. She had anticipated this might become an issue and had prepared accordingly. Of course, Lieutenant, as I mentioned to the specialist, I have civilian clothes with me. If you could direct me to an appropriate place to change, I will take care of it right away. The expression on Lieutenant Jensen's face softened slightly at her cooperative demeanor, but his voice remained official. There's a restroom at the end of the hall that you can use. However, I want to make it clear that this is not just a matter of convenience. The military uniform represents something significant, and it should only be worn by those who have earned that right through active service. His words hung in the air like a challenge, though Sarah felt they were not intended as a personal attack. Lieutenant Jensen was doing his job, enforcing rules that existed for respectful reasons, but she also sensed an undertone suggesting he might be making assumptions about her past and qualifications that were not necessarily accurate. I completely understand, Sarah said, maintaining her composure. The uniform indeed represents something significant, and I have great respect for that tradition. Turning toward the hallway indicated by Lieutenant Jensen, Sarah became aware of the attention her situation had drawn from others in the lobby. Some watched with clear curiosity, others with the detached interest of people observing a minor administrative drama. A few seemed to be waiting to see how the situation would resolve, as if her response to the lieutenant's directive was meant to reveal something important about her character. Sarah found the restroom and set her gear bag on a small bench inside. As she began changing from her field pants into the civilian clothes she had brought just in case, she contemplated the irony of the situation. These faded items had been with her during some of the most challenging moments of her military career, and now they were treated as if they were stolen valor rather than the earned years of dedicated service. The civilian clothes, khaki pants and a simple polo shirt, felt foreign after the familiar weight and texture of her military uniform. Carefully folding her field pants and placing them in her duffel bag, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked like any other middle-aged contractor arriving for a consulting assignment, which was exactly what she was. When she removed her jacket, the fabric lifted just enough to reveal the tattoos sprawling across her shoulders. A combat medic cross entwined with angel wings, with a date, April 17, 2011, that made every soldier within sight freeze in recognition, because that ink symbolized the hardest day in Harabistan. She quickly lowered her jacket, concealing the tattoo, but she knew its significance was a mystery. As she stepped out of the bathroom, the lobby had largely returned to its usual rhythm of activity. Lieutenant Jensen nodded approvingly at her civilian attire, and Specialist Reed completed her check-in with professional efficiency. Preparing to meet Sergeant Major Rodriguez, Sarah realized that this first interaction set a tone that would likely influence how others on the base perceived her role and qualifications. The morning was still young, and Fort Redemption stretched out before her like a landscape of opportunities and challenges. Sarah Miller had returned to the military world as a civilian, but the memories and experiences that defined her remained as vivid as the scars on her hands, and the knowledge that some stories were too important to remain buried in classified files. Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez stood behind her desk like a fortress of authority. Her weathered hands were clasped behind her back as she studied the woman sitting across from her. At 39, Elena had earned her position through 2 decades of unwavering dedication to the improvement of training, and her office reflected that commitment. Walls adorned with certificates of appreciation, photographs of units, and military relics that told stories without words. The morning light filtering through the blinds cast angular shadows on her face as she reviewed contractor Sarah Miller's file for the 3rd time that week. "Your credentials are impressive," Elena said, settling into her chair with the measured movements of someone who understood that every gesture carried weight. Combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, advanced trauma certification, 3 deployments to Harabistan between 2007 and 2010. What I don't see here is why someone with your experience decided to leave active duty. Sarah shifted slightly in her seat, aware of the probing nature of the question. She had anticipated this conversation. It was natural for military leadership to want to understand the motives of civilian contractors, especially those with extensive combat experience. Personal reasons, Sergeant Major. Family obligations that required me to return to civilian life. My father, a former serviceman, was seriously injured in the line of duty and I needed to care for him. The answer was technically accurate but deliberately incomplete, and both women understood the boundaries it established. Elena nodded, making a note in the file before decisively closing it. What matters now is what you can bring to our training program. These young medics are good, eager, dedicated, technically skilled, but most of them have never seen real combat, never made life and death decisions under fire. That's where experience becomes invaluable, Sarah agreed. Training scenarios can simulate the technical aspects of trauma care, but they cannot replicate the psychological pressure of working with wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Elena's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the mentor beneath her strict military facade. Colonel Hayes has given me broad authority to develop this training program, and I want it to truly prepare these guys for what they might face on the front lines. Book knowledge only goes so far. Through the office window, Sarah could see the expansive complex of medical training facilities at Fort Redemption. The modern buildings housed complex simulation equipment designed to recreate battlefield conditions. But she knew from experience that no technology could fully prepare a person for the reality of working with an injured comrade when shells were whistling overhead. Such preparation required a different type of education that could only be provided by those who had lived through those moments. I reviewed the training program you sent, Sarah said, pulling a folder from her bag. The technical components are sound, but I would like to suggest some changes to the scenario-based training. Real combat situations rarely follow textbook procedures. Elena leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. What changes? Chaos factors, Sarah replied. Multiple casualties arriving simultaneously, equipment failures at critical moments, communication breakdowns with command. In my experience, medics who can maintain focus and effectiveness when everything goes wrong are the ones who save lives when it matters most. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Elena called for the person to enter, and Corporal David Chen walked into the office with the purposeful stride of a soldier bearing important information. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with that confidence that comes from doing one's job well and knowing it. His uniform was impeccable, his posture professional. But Sarah noticed something in his eyes that suggested he was constantly assessing, constantly measuring the people around him. Sergeant Major, Colonel Hayes asked me to deliver this, David said, extending a sealed envelope toward Elena's desk. His gaze flicked briefly over Sarah, appraising her civilian attire with the kind of scrutiny she had come to expect from active personnel. Elena accepted the envelope and glanced at its contents before setting it aside. Thank you, Corporal. Are you familiar with our new training consultant? This is Corporal Chen. He will be one of the senior medics involved in your advanced training program. David stepped forward and extended his hand with practiced military courtesy. Ma'am, it's a pleasure to meet you. I look forward to working with you. His handshake was firm, professional, but Sarah sensed a barely perceptible reserve in his manner. Not hostility, but a kind of cautious appraisal that young soldiers often applied to civilian contractors. Likewise, Corporal, Sarah replied. The Sergeant Major has almost told me that you have excellent technical skills. This will be important for some of the scenarios we will be conducting. I appreciate that, ma'am, David said. If you don't mind, I would like to ask what your experience in combat medicine is. I mean, I know you're here as a contractor, but I'm curious about your field experience. The question was reasonable, even expected, but Sarah felt something beneath the surface. A challenge, perhaps, or just the natural skepticism of a soldier who had worked hard to develop his expertise and wanted to ensure that his instructors had earned their authority through genuine experience, not just classroom knowledge. Elena smoothly interjected. She has extensive deployment experience, Corporal. I'm sure she will bring valuable perspectives to the training program. David nodded, accepting the redirection with military discipline, but Sarah saw that her intentionally vague data only heightened his curiosity. Of course, Sergeant Major, I just really want to learn from someone with real experience. After David left the office, Elena turned to Sarah with an expression that suggested she had noticed the subtle dynamics of their exchange. You will encounter such attention from some young soldiers. They are good guys, but they grew up in an era when information is easily accessible and they expect transparency regarding qualifications and backgrounds. I understand, Sarah said. It's natural for them to want to know who they are learning from. I will do my best to earn their respect through the quality of my teaching, not through stories about my past. Elena stood and walked to the window, looking at the training facilities where groups of soldiers were conducting morning exercises. There is one more thing we need to discuss. The nature of your previous assignments means that certain aspects of your service record remain classified. I have been informed of the general plan, but even I do not have access to specific operational details. Sarah felt the familiar tension in her shoulders. The classified nature of her assignments in special operations had been both a source of pride and a burden throughout her military career. The missions that defined her service, the moments when her skills determined life and death for her fellow soldiers, were precisely the experiences she could never openly discuss. I am ready to work within those parameters, Sarah said. It's important that the training is effective. It's not about someone knowing the specific details of where and how I mastered these methods. Elena nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. I respect that, and I will support any boundaries you need to maintain, but you should know that some people on this base will be curious about the gaps in your record, especially if you demonstrate abilities that seem inconsistent with publicly available information. The warning was given with professional politeness, but Sarah understood its implications. Military communities were small, interconnected networks where information spread quickly, and speculation filled in the gaps where facts were absent. Her presence as a civilian contractor with an obviously extensive but mysteriously vague military past would inevitably raise questions and theories. I appreciate the warning, Sarah said. I have faced similar situations before. The key is to let the work speak for itself. Elena returned to her desk and pulled out the training schedule, which was marked with handwritten notes and corrections. Let's focus on the practical details. Your first session is scheduled for tomorrow morning with a group of 12 advanced medics. They have all completed basic trauma training, but they are preparing for deployment, so they need to be ready for anything. Sarah reviewed the schedule, noting the progression from basic refresher courses to increasingly complex scenario-based training. The program was well-designed, systematically building up to the kinds of high-pressure, multiple-casualty situations that defined combat medicine. I would like to add some elements focused on decision-making under extreme stress, methods for maintaining clarity when everything seems to be falling apart. That's exactly what I was hoping you would bring to the program, Elena said. These soldiers are technically competent, but they need to understand that classroom competence does not necessarily translate to effectiveness in combat. When their meeting concluded, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to embark on the challenging process of translating her hard-earned experience into lessons that could be taught without revealing the specific circumstances in which they were gained. She understood that the coming days would require her to navigate carefully between the desire to prepare these young soldiers for the realities they might face and the necessity of protecting information that remained classified years after the events that gave rise to it. As she walked through the base to her temporary quarters, Sarah was aware of the attention her presence continued to attract. Soldiers passing by her in the corridors nodded politely and greeted her professionally, but she felt the curiosity her civilian status generated among people accustomed to clearly defined hierarchies and easily identifiable roles. The afternoon sun began to descend toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Sarah of other sunsets in other places, where the beauty of the landscape sharply contrasted with the harsh realities of war. Tomorrow would bring her the first opportunity to share what she had learned in those places, filtered through the careful constraints of security protocols, but enriched by the knowledge that training and education could mean the difference between bringing soldiers home and having them be merely a memory. That evening, as Sarah reviewed her training materials in the quiet of her quarters, she allowed herself to recall some of the faces that motivated her to return to military training. The young medics she had worked with on the front lines, soldiers whose quick thinking and steady hands saved lives in the most challenging conditions imaginable. If she could help prepare the next generation to carry on that legacy, the complicated navigation of classified information and civilian contractor protocols would be worth any problems they might bring. The Fort Redemption mess hall buzzed with the familiar cacophony of military life at breakfast. Metal trays clattering against steam tables, the rhythmic thud of industrial food preparation, and hundreds of conversations merging into a steady hum of voices. Sarah Miller moved through the serving line with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been through countless military mess halls, selecting coffee that looked strong enough to dissolve paint and oatmeal that promised sustenance rather than flavor. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the tables where soldiers gathered, according to the invisible hierarchies governing military social dynamics. She found an empty table by the windows, preferring the relative isolation of navigating her way into already established groups. As she sat down at her table with her tray, Sarah noticed a subtle change in the nature of the conversations, which seemed to be stirred by her presence. The nearby tables grew quieter, voices lowered to more subdued levels, and she caught fragments of speculation about the new civilian contractor who somehow gained access to advanced medical training programs. "That's her," someone whispered from a table of junior soldiers. "Grace said she has some kind of classified past, but no one knows what exactly." Sarah focused on her breakfast, long accustomed to being the subject of military gossip. In her experience, curiosity about new personnel was natural and usually harmless. Soldiers were trained to be observant, and the appearance of anyone whose role was not immediately obvious would inevitably generate questions and theories. A few tables away, Private First Class Maria Guerrero sat with a group of medics preparing for deployment. Her breakfast was forgotten as she listened to the speculations surrounding Sarah Miller. At 20 years old, Maria possessed the focused intensity that characterized soldiers who took their duties seriously. She had voluntarily pursued combat medic training despite the concerns of family members worried about the dangers, but Maria understood that her skills could mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. "I heard she used to be in special operations," said Private Brittany Cox, leaning forward conspiratorially. But when Lieutenant Jensen made her change out of those old field pants yesterday, she didn't argue or throw a fit. It seemed like she understood how the system works. Maria glanced at Sarah's table, studying the posture and demeanor of the older woman. In the way Sarah carried herself, alert yet relaxed, aware of her surroundings without appearing paranoid, there was something that spoke of genuine military experience. "Maybe we should just ask her ourselves instead of guessing," Maria suggested. "Sure," snorted Corporal David Chen from the next table. "Because civilian contractors are always eager to discuss their mysterious past with random soldiers." His voice carried enough volume for Sarah to hear the sarcasm, even though his words were directed at his own dining companions. Sarah continued to eat methodically, giving no indication that she noticed the conversation. She had long learned that reacting to every provocation or attempt to draw her into defending her background only attracted more attention. It was better to let her work speak for itself and allow curious soldiers to draw their own conclusions, based on observations rather than assumptions. The dynamics of the dining area reflected broader patterns that Sarah had learned from her own military service. Young soldiers, especially those who had not yet been deployed, often exhibited a mix of confidence and uncertainty that manifested in skepticism toward anyone whose qualifications were not immediately obvious. This was a natural defense mechanism in an environment where expertise could literally be a matter of life and death. Doubt about qualifications was not only acceptable but necessary. Staff Sergeant Thomas Gunny Riley entered the dining area with the purposeful gait of a man on a tight schedule. At 35, he bore the weathered look of a career soldier who had seen multiple deployments and understood the value of experience over theory. His eyes swept the dining area with automatic assessment before settling on Sarah's table. Something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, but a kind of focused attention that suggested he had seen what others had missed. Gunny grabbed his breakfast and approached Sarah's table with deliberate casualness. "These places fill up quickly, and I noticed you found a good spot by the window." Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I'm Sarah Miller, a civilian contractor working with the medical training program." "Gunny Riley, logistics and supply," he replied, sitting down with careful movements of someone managing old injuries. "I heard you're coming in to work with their medics. They need all the real perspective they can get." The comment was made casually, but Sarah sensed something beneath the surface. A probing quality that suggested Gunny Riley was assessing her responses just as much as he was engaging in conversation. She had encountered this before with senior sergeants who had developed finely tuned instincts for evaluating personnel. "Experience is valuable," Sarah agreed, "but every deployment, every situation is different. The best training prepares soldiers to adapt and think critically, not just to follow predetermined procedures." Gunny nodded, sipping his coffee and studying Sarah's face. "I've seen medics who were technically flawless in training, but completely fell apart when things got chaotic on the front lines. And I've seen others who might not have been textbook perfect, but had something else, a kind of calm under pressure that can't be taught." "That comes from exposure," Sarah said cautiously. "The more challenging situations a person has been through, the better they become at maintaining focus when everything seems to be falling apart." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Karen Burns, who approached their table with the swift efficiency that characterized her approach to most professional interactions. At 34, Karen had earned a reputation as one of the most competent medical officers at Fort Redemption, combining technical expertise with leadership qualities that inspired confidence in stressful situations. "Miller, I'm Captain Burns from the Medical Training Department," she said, extending her hand. "I wanted to introduce myself before your first session this morning and see if you need anything to get started." Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of both confidence and professionalism. "I've reviewed the training materials and everything looks well organized. I'm looking forward to working with your medics." Karen took an empty chair from a nearby table and joined the conversation. "I've been reviewing your proposed changes to the curriculum. The emphasis on decision-making under stress is exactly what we need. Too many of our training scenarios assume ideal conditions that rarely exist in real combat situations." "That has been my experience as well," Sarah replied. "Soldiers who perform best under pressure are usually those who have learned to work effectively when communication is down, equipment is malfunctioning, and they are dealing with more casualties than they have resources." Gunny placed his coffee cup down with deliberate precision. "It sounds like you have some experience in such situations. Not many understand how quickly things can go wrong when you're dealing with multiple wounded soldiers and limited resources." Sarah met his gaze calmly. "I have had some experience, yes. Enough to know that the difference between effective training and an academic exercise often lies in the presence of realistic stressors that force people to make quick decisions." Karen leaned slightly forward, her interest clearly piqued. "What stressors do you recommend?" "We have simulation equipment that can replicate various environmental conditions, but I'm always looking for ways to make training more realistic." "Time pressure is crucial," Sarah said. "In real situations, medics rarely have the luxury of taking their time to consider all options. Adding artificial time constraints forces trainees to make quick decisions and live with the consequences." "And equipment failures," Gunny added, nodding in agreement. "Nothing teaches improvisation like the failure of your primary medical kit when you need it most." Sarah smiled slightly. "And communication breakdowns. Scenarios where medics have to operate without clear command guidance or coordinate actions with units using different communication protocols." The conversation flowed naturally until it was interrupted by the appearance of Master Sergeant Michael "Mac" McMillan, whose weathered face and measured gait spoke of decades of military service. At 58, Mac had become something of an institutional memory at Fort Redemption, the senior sergeant who had seen enough changes in military culture and training to provide valuable perspective on what works and what doesn't. "Good morning, folks," Mac said, nodding to the group. I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about realistic training scenarios. That's music to my ears. I've been saying for years that we need to prepare soldiers for the chaos of real operations, not just training situations. Karen gestured to the empty chair. Master Sergeant McMillan, meet Sarah Miller, our new training consultant. She has shared some ideas about adding stressors to our medical training scenarios. Mac studied Sarah with the kind of appraisal that comes from years of experience in evaluating personnel. Miller, nice to meet you. What is your experience in military medicine? The question was direct but not confrontational. Just a natural inquiry from a senior soldier wanting to understand the qualifications of the person who would be training his medics. Sarah anticipated this moment and prepared an answer that would satisfy professional curiosity without revealing classified information. I served as a combat medic for several years with deployments to Harabistan, she said. After leaving active duty, I worked in civilian emergency medicine before transitioning to training and consulting. Mac nodded slowly, processing the information. What years were you deployed? From 2007 to 2010, Sarah replied, maintaining a neutral and factual tone. Something flickered in Mac's expression, not recognition, but a sharpening of attention that suggested the time frame triggered some memory or association. He paused for a moment, seemingly lost in thought, before refocusing on the conversation. Those were challenging years, he finally said. Many good soldiers served during that time, and many of them have valuable experiences to share with the next generation. The comment seemed to mark the end of his direct questions, but Sarah felt that Master Sergeant McMillan was holding back information for future consideration. She had encountered this before with senior sergeants who had extensive networks and a kind of institutional memory that allowed them to piece together fragments of information that might seem unrelated to others. As breakfast continued, Sarah realized that their table had become the center of attention throughout the dining hall. Other soldiers were clearly listening to snippets of their discussion, and she saw phones appearing on nearby tables as social media messages were undoubtedly being crafted to share observations about the mysterious civilian contractor and her apparently extensive military past. The morning light grew stronger, signaling the approach of the workday and Sarah's first training session with the advanced medics at Fort Redemption. As she prepared to leave the dining hall, she recognized that her first 24 hours on base had established patterns that would likely define her entire assignment. Curiosity about her past, skepticism regarding her qualifications, and a kind of thorough assessment that characterized military communities when they encountered outsiders claiming expertise in life and death skills. The Combat Medic Training Center at Fort Redemption stood as a monument to modern military medical education, its sleek exterior concealing simulation laboratories capable of replicating any combat environment, from desert operations to urban warfare. Sarah Miller approached the main entrance right at 8 o'clock, her civilian attire practical and professional. Dark cargo pants, a moisture-wicking polo shirt, and sturdy boots that could withstand any physical demands that training might require. In her hands, she carried a worn leather medical bag that had served in places where improvisation meant the difference between saving lives and writing loss reports. Inside the main training bay, 12 soldiers stood in formation awaiting her arrival. They represented the cream of the combat medics at Fort Redemption, selected by Sergeant Major Rodriguez for advanced training based on their technical skills, leadership potential, and upcoming deployment schedules. Sarah saw a mix of anticipation and skepticism on their faces as she entered the room, a natural reaction from professionals who had worked hard to develop their expertise and wanted to ensure that any additional training would be worth their time. Private First Class Maria Guerrero stood at attention in the front row, her medical kit organized with the precise order that characterized soldiers who took their duties seriously. Next to her, Corporal David Chen maintained a professional posture, his eyes tracking every movement of Sarah, with an appraisal that would later be discussed in group chats and informal conversations. Other medics, a mix of junior soldiers and experienced sergeants, displayed varying degrees of curiosity about the civilian contractor who somehow earned the right to train them in advanced combat medicine. At ease, Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to commanding attention in high-pressure situations. I'm Sarah Miller, and for the next 2 weeks, I will be working with you to enhance your capabilities in providing trauma care in combat situations. She approached the front of the room with economical steps, placing her medical bag on the central table where it would be visible to all trainees. Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules. First, everything we do here is designed to prepare you for situations where ideal conditions do not exist, and textbook procedures may be insufficient. Second, I expect you to challenge assumptions, including mine, if you believe there is a better way to solve a problem. Staff Sergeant Juan Herrera, a veteran medic with 2 previous deployments, raised his hand. Ma'am, what is your experience in combat medicine? I mean, we've all heard different stories about your background, but it would be helpful to know what situations you've actually worked in. The question was reasonable and posed with professional politeness, but Sarah recognized the underlying challenge. These soldiers had invested significant time and effort into developing their medical skills, and they deserved to know that their instructor possessed genuine expertise, not just theoretical knowledge. I served as a combat medic in Harabistan from 2007 to 2010, Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact with Herrera. During that time, I worked in various capacities, at forward operating bases, accompanying convoys, and on some specialized missions that I cannot discuss in detail due to classification restrictions. David Chen shifted slightly, his expression suggesting that the intentionally vague reference to classified missions only heightened his skepticism. With all due respect, ma'am, many people served in Harabistan during those years. What makes your experience particularly relevant to advanced trauma training? Sarah nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of his concern. Fair question, Corporal. Instead of telling you about my experience, let me show you. We will start with a scenario that will demonstrate some of the challenges you may face on the front lines. She approached the control panel that operated the simulation equipment of the training facility with practiced efficiency. Sarah programmed a complex scenario involving multiple casualties, equipment failures, and communication breakdowns. The lighting in the room dimmed to simulate the limited visibility of dawn operations, while the speakers began generating the ambient noise of helicopter blades and distant explosions. Your unit has just sustained casualties from an improvised explosive device, Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the simulated chaos. You have 4 wounded soldiers, limited medical supplies, and your primary communication equipment is damaged. Your medical helicopter will arrive in 15 minutes, but the weather conditions are deteriorating. 4 training mannequins, equipped with realistic wound simulators, were positioned around the room, each representing different types of injuries requiring immediate medical intervention. The complexity of the scenario was immediately apparent. No medic could handle all 4 victims at once, necessitating the team's prioritization, delegation, and coordination of their efforts under extreme time pressure. Guerrero, Chen, you take the soldiers with severe chest and abdominal injuries, Sarah ordered. Herrera, Cox are handling traumatic amputations. Everyone else, organize a casualty collection point and prepare for medical evacuation. The medics sprang into action with the disciplined efficiency of their training, but within minutes, the limitations of textbook procedures became evident. Simulated equipment failures that Sarah had programmed into the scenario meant that standard medical devices malfunctioned at critical moments, forcing teams to improvise solutions using any available resources. Maria Guerrero found herself working on the mannequin depicting a soldier with a severe chest injury, but her suction device failed just as she attempted to clear the airway. For a moment she hesitated, her training emphasizing the importance of proper equipment for such procedures. "What are you going to do, Guerrero?" Sarah shouted, moving between teams to observe their responses to the escalating problems. "I need to clear the airway, but my suction equipment isn't working," Maria replied, frustration evident in her voice. "So what's your backup plan? In real combat, equipment constantly fails. You must be able to adapt." Maria looked around the simulated battlefield, her mind racing through alternative approaches. Finally, she grabbed a water bottle from her backpack and began using it for manual airway irrigation, not by the book, but effective improvisation under the circumstances. Good thinking, Sarah said approvingly. The perfect equipment is a luxury rarely available in real combat situations. Meanwhile, David Chen was struggling with his own equipment failure. The pressure dressings he needed to control the severe bleeding in his casualty were programmed to fail, leaving him with insufficient materials to stop the life-threatening hemorrhage. His initial reaction was to request additional supplies, but Sarah's scenario design meant that no extra resources were available. "Time is running out, Chen," Sarah announced. "Your casualty is losing a lot of blood and medical evacuation is still 10 minutes away. What's your solution?" David's jaw tightened with frustration. "I need the right pressure dressings to control this bleeding. Without the proper equipment, I can't effectively treat this wound." Sarah approached his position, sitting down next to the mannequin. "Show me what you've already tried." David demonstrated his attempts to control the bleeding using available materials, but his approach remained rigidly focused on textbook procedures that required specific equipment. Sarah saw that his technical knowledge was excellent, but his ability to improvise solutions was limited by his adherence to established protocols. "Look," Sarah said, taking the mannequin and using materials that David had dismissed as inadequate: torn clothing, improvised pressure points, and creative bandaging methods. She demonstrated how to stop the bleeding without access to standard medical supplies. Other medics paused their work to observe Sarah's technique. Her movements were smooth and confident, showcasing a kind of muscle memory that comes from extensive real-world experience. She was not just demonstrating alternative procedures, she was showing them how to think creatively under pressure. "The key to understanding is the underlying physiology," Sarah explained while working. "If you know why a certain technique works, you can adapt it to any available materials." As the scenario progressed, Sarah introduced additional complications designed to test the medic's ability to maintain effectiveness under increasing stress. Communication equipment completely failed, forcing teams to coordinate actions using hand signals. The weather conditions in the simulation worsened further, adding time pressure as the window for medical evacuation shrank. Staff Sergeant Herrera, working on a traumatic amputation, felt his confidence grow as he adapted to the changing conditions. Initial equipment failures forced him to abandon rigid procedural thinking and focus on achieving results with whatever resources were available. "This is actually more realistic than our usual training scenarios," he admitted to his partner, Private Cox. Brittany Cox nodded, sweat trickling down her forehead from the physical and mental strain of the exercise. "It's definitely more stressful, but I see how this kind of training better prepares us for real deployments." Sarah continued to move between teams, offering guidance and introducing new complications that forced the medics to constantly adapt their approaches. She noticed that initial skepticism began to give way to respect as the soldiers recognized the value of training that challenged their assumptions and pushed them beyond their comfort zones. The 15-minute scenario felt like an hour to the participants, but when the simulated medical helicopter arrived and the exercise concluded, Sarah saw that something fundamental had changed in the group's dynamics. The medics who had started the session doubting her qualifications now looked at her with the attention that true expertise demanded. "Debrief in 5 minutes," Sarah announced, giving the soldiers time to secure their equipment and reflect on what they had just experienced. "I want to hear what you learned and what questions you have about adapting standard procedures to unconventional situations." As the medics gathered around the central table, Sarah noticed that their body language had subtly shifted. They no longer regarded her as an outsider whose data needed verification, but as an instructor whose knowledge had been demonstrated in practice. The shift was gradual yet unmistakable, a kind of respect that had to be earned, not given. First Class Private Maria Guerrero was the first to speak during the debrief. "Ma'am, is that improvised airway clearing technique something you learned from field manuals or real-world experience?" Sarah met her gaze calmly. "Field manuals are written by people who assume you will have access to proper equipment and ideal conditions. Real combat rarely provides either." The session established trust in Sarah in a way that no discussions of classified missions could achieve. These soldiers had seen her demonstrate skills that went beyond textbook knowledge, and they understood that such expertise could only be gained through extensive practical application in conditions of pressure that no simulation could fully replicate. The afternoon heat bore down on Fort Redemption like a suffocating blanket, turning the open training area into an oven that tested the endurance of even the most seasoned soldiers. Sarah Miller stood by the casualty evacuation lane, watching her medics prepare for the second training session of the day. The morning scenarios indoors established her authority, but the afternoon exercise would push the soldiers beyond their comfort zone in ways that air-conditioned simulation labs could not. Staff Sergeant Gunny Riley approached the training area with a tablet and an expression of professional concern. He observed Sarah's methods from a distance, noting how her students reacted to instructions that challenged traditional approaches to combat medicine. Something about her teaching style triggered memories he couldn't quite place, a familiarity with techniques that were typically not covered in standard military medical training. "Miller," Gunny said, settling into the shade of the nearest equipment trailer, "do you mind if I observe this session? I'm always interested to see new approaches to training, especially those that seem to receive such positive feedback from medics." Sarah looked up from her preparation checklist, noting how carefully Gunny had positioned himself to observe both the training exercise and her reactions to various situations. "Of course, Staff Sergeant, the more eyes we have on safety protocols, the better. The afternoon scenarios will be physically demanding." The 12 medics assembled in formation looked less skeptical than they had that morning, but Sarah could see the fatigue on their faces, stemming from being pushed beyond their usual procedures. Specialist Maria Guerrero maintained a professional posture despite the sweat already beading on her forehead, while Corporal David Chen checked and rechecked his medical kit with the nervous energy of someone who had learned that equipment failures were now an expected part of training, not just annoying accidents. "Today we're working on casualty evacuation under fire," Sarah announced, her voice easily carrying across the training area. "You will be moving injured soldiers 400 meters across open terrain, facing simulated enemy contact, equipment failures, and multiple casualties arriving simultaneously." She gestured to a series of obstacles arranged to mimic the challenging terrain medics might encounter in real combat situations. Concrete barriers representing collapsed buildings, sand pits simulating difficult movement, and areas of open ground where teams would be subjected to simulated enemy fire. "The key to a successful casualty evacuation is not just medical knowledge," Sarah continued. "It's the ability to maintain situational awareness while providing life-saving care in the worst possible conditions." Staff Sergeant Juan Herrera raised his hand. "Ma'am, what kind of enemy contact should we expect during the exercise?" "Simulated gunfire, possible mortar strikes, and chaos that makes communication difficult and coordination nearly impossible," Sarah replied. "Your task is to get your casualties to the evacuation point alive, no matter what else is happening around you." The exercise began with the sharp crack of blank rounds and the distinctive whistle of simulated incoming shells. Immediately, the carefully organized formation of medics broke into a controlled chaos of soldiers reacting to enemy contact while simultaneously trying to provide medical assistance to the injured mannequins scattered across the training area. Maria Guerrero found herself crawling across open ground to a casualty with a simulated head injury. Her medical kit dragged behind her as she tried to maintain a low profile while bullets whizzed overhead. The physical demands of the exercise were intense, crawling, lifting, and carrying injured soldiers in full gear under the blazing Arizona sun. "Keep your head down, Guerrero," Sarah shouted through the simulated gunfire. "Real bullets don't care how important your medical mission is." The training exercise quickly revealed the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application under stress. David Chen, technically skilled in controlled conditions, struggled to maintain focus while juggling multiple competing demands. Treating his injured patient, coordinating with other team members, and responding to a simulated enemy threat that required constant movement and repositioning. Sarah moved across the training ground with the smooth grace of someone who had been through similar situations under real fire. She was not just observing the training, She was demonstrating methods for maintaining effectiveness under attack, showing medics how to use the terrain for cover while continuing to provide quality medical care. "Look, Gunny," she shouted, illustrating how to use a damaged vehicle as both cover and a platform for medical treatment. Her movements were economical and purposeful, showcasing a kind of muscle memory that comes from extensive practice in life and death situations. Gunny Riley watched with growing recognition. Something in Sarah's technique stirred memories he had tried to bury for years. The way she navigated the simulated battlefield, the efficient manner in which she utilized available cover, and most importantly, the absolute calm she maintained while working with casualties under fire. These skills could not be acquired in training conditions. The exercise reached its climax when Sarah presented a mass casualty event that exceeded the medic's ability to give individual attention to each injured soldier. 7 casualties arrived simultaneously at the evacuation point, each requiring immediate medical intervention, but only 4 medics were available to assist. "This is where triage becomes critically important," Sarah announced, moving between the injured to demonstrate rapid assessment methods. "You have 30 seconds to determine who gets priority treatment and who has to wait." The moral weight of the decision was immediately evident to the soldiers. In training scenarios with unlimited resources and time, each victim received optimal care, but this exercise forced them to confront the harsh reality that combat medics sometimes had to make choices about which soldiers received immediate attention and which had to endure a longer wait for treatment. Private Brittany Cox found herself assigned to a casualty with serious but not immediately life-threatening injuries, while soldiers with more critical wounds received priority attention from other medics. The emotional difficulty of maintaining professional detachment while listening to simulated cries for help was overwhelming. "I know this soldier needs help," Brittany said to Sarah, her voice taut with stress. "It feels wrong to make him wait when I could be doing something." "That's exactly the decision you'll face on the front lines," Sarah replied, her tone compassionate yet firm. "Triage isn't about abandoning the injured. It's about maximizing the number of soldiers who come home alive." As the exercise continued, Sarah found herself working directly with one of the most challenging casualties, demonstrating advanced trauma techniques while maintaining the quick pace demanded by the scenario. The physical strain and mental stress of the simulation, combined with the afternoon heat, caused her polo shirt to cling tightly to her back. Staff Sergeant Gunny Riley, watching from his position at the evacuation point, noticed something that made his blood run cold. As Sarah leaned forward to demonstrate the proper spinal immobilization technique, the damp fabric of her shirt outlined the contours of a large tattoo on her upper back. Not just a decorative pattern, but something that looked official, purposeful, almost like a unit insignia. Ghani stepped closer, using the pretext of checking safety protocols to get a better look. What he saw confirmed his growing suspicions and triggered memories he had tried to suppress for over a decade. The tattoo, partially visible through the clinging fabric, seemed to depict wings. It was the distinctive outline of military medical insignia, not just a decorative design. The exercise concluded with the successful evacuation of all casualties, but Ghani Riley barely noticed the end of the training scenario. His mind raced through fragments of memories, classified briefings, redacted after-action reports, and whispered stories about a female medic who had performed legendary feats during some of the darkest days of the Harabistan conflict. "Great job, everyone," Sarah announced to her exhausted students. "Take 15 minutes for hydration and recovery, then we'll conduct a detailed debrief of the exercise." As the medics dispersed to find shade and water, Ghani approached Sarah with cautious deliberation. His expression was neutral, but she saw the intensity in his eyes that suggested he was processing information far beyond the usual observation of a training session. "Miller, that was impressive," Ghani said, his voice carefully controlled. "Your methods of evacuating casualties are remarkably sophisticated. Where exactly did you learn to operate under fire like that?" Sarah met his gaze calmly, recognizing the probing nature of the question. "Experience, Staff Sergeant. The kind that comes from working in challenging conditions where adaptability is essential for survival." Ghani nodded slowly, setting her response aside for future consideration. Just some of those methods looked remarkably familiar, like techniques I've seen described in classified reports on specialized unit operations. The comment hung in the air between them, laden with subtext that they both understood, but neither was ready to discuss directly. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but she felt that Staff Sergeant Riley was piecing together fragments of a puzzle that most people were not even aware existed. "If you'll excuse me," Sarah said, "I need to prepare for the debrief. Today's exercise provided many learning opportunities that we need to discuss while they're still fresh in everyone's minds." As she stepped away to gather her training materials, Sarah was acutely aware that Ghani Riley continued to watch her with such focused attention that suggested he suspected much more than he let on. The afternoon heat felt even more oppressive, and she felt the weight of her hidden tattoo like a physical burden on her shoulders. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the training ground as Sarah's medics gradually recovered from the physical and emotional strains of the evacuation exercise. But for Ghani Riley, watching from the shadow of the equipment trailer, the day's training revealed far more than just advanced medical techniques. Something about Sarah Miller did not fit her official status as a contractor, and the tattoo he had caught a glimpse of that day hinted at a story that was far more significant than anyone at Fort Redemption knew. The groundwork for a much larger revelation had been laid, although neither Sarah nor Ghani were yet ready to acknowledge the full implications of what had been uncovered that day. Staff Sergeant Ghani Riley sat alone in his office long after the official end of the workday, fluorescent lights humming overhead as he stared at the secure computer terminal that connected him to classified military databases. His hands trembled slightly as he entered his access credentials, knowing that the search he was about to conduct could either confirm his suspicions or prove that his imagination was working overtime under the Arizona heat. The image of that tattoo, glimpsed through Sarah Miller's sweat-soaked shirt, had been etched in his memory for hours, evoking fragments of classified briefings he had attended many years ago. The database search interface appeared on his screen, and Ghani began typing carefully crafted queries designed to access information about the medical personnel of Special Operations who served in Harabistan from 2007 to 2010. Most records were heavily redacted, entire sections crossed out for operational security, but he was looking for something specific: any mention of female medics who served in elite units during that time. 3 floors down, in the medical facility of the base, Dr. Benjamin Carter was conducting his own investigation using entirely different resources. The civilian contractor had arrived at Fort Redemption with impeccable credentials and a recommendation from the Pentagon that bypassed the usual vetting procedures, but something about Sarah Miller's training methods piqued his professional curiosity. At 55, Benjamin had spent enough time in military medical circles to recognize techniques that went far beyond standard combat medic training. "Angela, I need you to pull some personnel files for me," Benjamin said to his administrative assistant, who was preparing to leave for the evening. "Specifically, any available records on our new training consultant, Sarah Miller." Angela Rodriguez, a civilian employee who had worked in military medical administration for over 15 years, paused at the door. "Doctor, you know that contractor personnel files are usually quite limited. Most detailed background information remains with their parent organizations." "I understand," Benjamin replied, "but pull everything we have access to. I'm particularly interested in her deployment history and any specialized training certifications." Meanwhile, in the non-commissioned officers club located near the center of Fort Redemption, Master Sergeant Michael Mac McMillan was sipping a beer while his mind processed a conversation he had overheard at breakfast that morning. At 58, Mac had developed a sort of institutional memory that allowed him to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information over decades of military service. Sarah Miller's mention of serving in Harabistan from 2007 to 2010 triggered something in his memory. Not a specific incident, but an unsettling feeling that he had heard her name before in contexts unrelated to standard medical training. Mac pulled out his personal phone and began scrolling through his contacts, searching for retired colleagues who might have served in Harabistan at the same time as Sarah Miller. The military community was surprisingly small, especially among special operations personnel, and stories had a way of lingering long after the events that spawned them had been classified and shelved. Back in his office, Ganny Riley's database search began yielding results that made his pulse quicken. A series of action reports from 2009 contained references to, quote, exceptional medical support during operations that were described only in vague terms. The names of the personnel involved were fully redacted, but the visible operational details painted a picture of medical heroism in the most extreme combat conditions. One report in particular caught his attention. A mission summary from April 17, 2011, which described an ambush on a convoy that resulted in numerous casualties and a medical evacuation that required unprecedented individual initiative under constant enemy fire. The medic involved apparently worked alone for more than 2 hours, treating and stabilizing the injured while the unit awaited reinforcements and evacuation. Ghani felt his breath catch as he read the sparse details that had survived the classification process. April 17, 2011, the same date he had seen on Sarah Miller's tattoo that day. The coincidence seemed impossible, but the implications were staggering if his suspicions were correct. At the medical facility, Dr. Benjamin Carter was reviewing the official file of contractor Sarah Miller with growing bewilderment. Her education was impressive. Advanced trauma certification, specialized training in field medicine, extensive experience in a civilian emergency department, but there were gaps in her timeline that suggested periods of service or training not documented in available records. This doesn't make sense, Benjamin muttered to himself, noting that there was a 3-year gap in Sarah's civilian medical career between 2007 and 2010, which was simply marked as military service with no details about units, deployments, or specialties. His computer pinged with an incoming secure message from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a colleague from Walter Reed Medical Center, who had worked extensively with special operations medical personnel. Benjamin sent her a standard inquiry about Sarah Miller's past, hoping Jennifer's connections might provide additional context about their new training consultant. The message was brief but intriguing. Benjamin, the name Sarah Miller sounds familiar, but I can't discuss details through regular channels. Can you arrange a secure call? This may be more significant than you think. At the Sergeant's Club, Sergeant Mac McMillan contacted retired Command Sergeant Major Bill Tucker, who had served as a senior sergeant advisor in Harabistan at the same time Sarah Miller mentioned. Bill's memory was sharp, and he had a reputation for knowing the stories behind the stories that shaped special operations history. Mac, you said her name is Sarah Miller? Bill's voice crackled over the phone with a slight delay from the international call. Can you describe her? Age, physical characteristics, general demeanor. Mac provided the details he could recall from their brief breakfast meeting, noting Sarah's calm professionalism and how she had deflected questions about her specific military experience. Oh my God, Bill said after a long pause. If this is the one I think it is, then you have a real legend walking around your base. But Mac, I can't discuss this over an unsecured line. Is there a way to check if she has a specific tattoo? What tattoo? Mac asked, his pulse quickening. A medical cross with angel wings and the date, April 17, 2011. If she has that tattoo, then you need to understand that you're dealing with someone who is in a completely different category. Mac felt the pieces of the puzzle click into place with an almost audible snap. The way Sarah had meticulously dodged questions about her past, the complex medical techniques that impressed even seasoned military personnel, and, most importantly, the feeling that her name was familiar from contexts that had nothing to do with ordinary training assignments. Returning to his office, Gunny Riley expanded his search in the database, including records from units operating in the specific region of Karabistan where the incident on April 17, 2011 occurred. The information was heavily classified, but his clearance level allowed him access to operational summaries that provided insight into missions that had never been publicly acknowledged. One document struck him, a commendation that had been written but never presented due to the classified nature of the operation. The text was heavily redacted, but what remained was enough to confirm his suspicions. exhibited extraordinary courage and medical skill during prolonged contact with the enemy, single-handedly stabilized numerous critically injured, actions directly responsible for saving lives during the convoy evacuation. The document was dated April 18, 2011, clearly referring to actions from the previous day. The medic's name was completely crossed out, but gender was indicated through the use of female pronouns throughout the commendation. Gunny's hands trembled as he printed the document and locked it in his desk drawer. If Sarah Miller was indeed the medic described in these classified reports, then Fort Redemption was harboring someone whose actions saved lives in conditions that most people could not even imagine. His secure phone rang, displaying a call from Master Sergeant McMillan. Gunny answered immediately, feeling that Mac's call was related to his own investigation. "Gunny, I need to ask you something confidential," Mac said without preamble. "During your observation of training today, did you notice anything unusual about Sarah Miller's appearance? Specifically, any tattoos that might have been visible?" Gunny felt a lump in his throat. "Why are you asking, Mac?" "Because I just spoke with someone who served in Karabistan in 2011, and if Sarah Miller is who we think she is, then we are dealing with someone whose history has been classified at the highest levels for over 10 years. The two senior sergeants agreed to meet immediately in Gunny's office, understanding that the conversation they were about to have would require a level of discretion that could only be maintained in person. Hanging up, both men felt the weight of a revelation that would fundamentally change how everyone at Fort Redemption understood the woman who was training their medics. Benjamin Carter was setting up a secure video call with his colleague at Walter Reed, knowing that the conversation he was about to have could provide answers to questions that had troubled him since Sarah Miller's arrival. Pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fit together, and the picture they were forming suggested that Fort Redemption had unknowingly been hosting a legend. Evening shadows grew longer across the base as several investigations converged on one staggering conclusion. Sarah Miller was not just a qualified medical instructor, but someone whose actions in combat had earned her a place in the classified annals of military heroism. The tattoo that Gunny Riley had glimpsed that day was about to become the key that would unlock a story of bravery hidden in plain sight for over 10 years. Colonel Daniel Hayes stood behind his desk at 2100 hours. His usually immaculate office was illuminated only by the harsh light of his secure computer terminal and classified documents spread across his workspace. At 48 years old, Hayes had commanded Fort Redemption for 3 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the phone call he received 20 minutes ago from the Pentagon. The voice on the other end was abrupt, official, and carried an authority that surpassed ordinary military hierarchies. "Colonel, this is Brigadier General Evelyn Stone, Special Operations Command. I understand you have a civilian contractor named Sarah Miller conducting medical training at your facility." Hayes confirmed the information, expecting the usual request for contractor performance or security clearances. Instead, General Stone provided information that fundamentally changed his understanding of who had been walking around his base for the past week. "Colonel, Sarah Miller is not just any contractor. She is Captain Sarah Miller, a former Special Operations medic, awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V device, and 3 Purple Hearts. More importantly, she is the medic who single-handedly saved 23 soldiers during an ambush in Snake Canyon on April 17, 2011. We kept her identity classified for her own protection, but it seems the information is starting to leak." Now Hayes was looking at the classified personnel file that had been sent to the secure terminal within minutes of the phone call. The document painted a picture of heroism that seemed almost fictional in its scale. A female medic working alone under constant enemy fire for over 2 hours, treating the wounded with improvised equipment, calling in tactical air support, and coordinating evacuation procedures for the injured. A knock at his office door interrupted his reading. "Come in," Hayes shouted, and Staff Sergeant Gunny Riley entered the office, carrying a folder of papers and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something significant. "Sir, I apologize for the late hour, but I believe we have a situation that requires immediate command attention," Gunny said, his voice taut with controlled excitement. Hayes gestured for him to take a seat across from his desk. Staff Sergeant, I think I know what you're here to discuss. Please sit down and tell me what you found. Gunny opened his folder and placed several printed documents on the colonel's desk. Sir, this afternoon during medical exercises, I noticed something that prompted me to search the classified database. I believe our contractor, Sarah Miller, may not be who we think she is. Go on, Hayes said, although he already knew where the conversation was heading. Sir, I caught a glimpse of a tattoo on her back during today's exercises. The design appeared to represent a medical emblem with a specific date, April 17th, 2011. When I cross-referenced that date with classified mission reports, I found references to a female medic who performed extraordinary actions during an ambush on a convoy. Hayes nodded slowly. Gunny, what I am about to tell you must not leave this office without my explicit permission. You have stumbled upon information that has been classified at the highest levels for over 10 years. Another knock interrupted their conversation. This time, Master Sergeant Mac McMillan entered the office along with Dr. Benjamin Carter, both men wearing expressions that suggested they had conducted their own investigations. Colonel, Mac said, we need to discuss Sarah Miller. I've been in touch with retired personnel who served in Harabistan, and Dr. Carter has been communicating with colleagues at Walter Reed. We believe she may be someone whose identity was intentionally concealed. Hayes looked around his office at the three men who had independently arrived at the same conclusion. Gentlemen, close the door and take a seat. What I am about to share with you is classified, but given what you have already discovered, you need to understand the full scope of who we are dealing with. Carter spoke first. Colonel, my colleague at Walter Reed confirmed that Sarah Miller is a legend in the medical circles of special operations. Apparently, her actions during one engagement saved more lives than most medics save in entire deployments. That's true, Hayes replied, opening the classified dossier on his desk. Sarah Miller is Captain Sarah Miller, and she is the medic known as the Ghost of the Canyon. On April 17, 2011, her convoy was ambushed in a valley north of Snake Canyon. 18 soldiers were wounded, and the unit was pinned down by constant enemy fire from high ground on three sides of the valley. Mac leaned forward, his weathered face tense with attention. Sir, I've heard fragments of this story, but never with specific details or names. Hayes continued reading from the classified report. Captain Miller operated alone for 2 hours and 17 minutes, providing aid to the injured under direct fire. She improvised medical equipment, used tactical radio procedures to coordinate air support, and personally carried wounded soldiers to safe positions. When helicopters arrived for evacuation, she stabilized all 18 wounded soldiers and prevented any further casualties. Gunny felt a lump in his throat as he listened to the official account of actions that perfectly matched the evidence he had uncovered. Sir, why was this information classified? Such actions usually lead to public recognition and awards. Because, Hayes replied, Captain Miller's unit was conducting a classified operation that was never officially acknowledged. The convoy was transporting reconnaissance assets, the presence of which in Harabistan could not be admitted. Publishing her heroic actions would compromise ongoing operations and potentially endanger other personnel. Carter shook his head in disbelief. So, she lived as a civilian contractor, unable to discuss the most significant events of her military career. Exactly, Hayes confirmed. After recovering from the injuries sustained during the ambush, Captain Miller was given a choice: continue her military career under a new name and assignment, or transition to civilian life with a partially classified service record. She chose civilian life to care for her injured father, but her security clearance and classification status remained active. Max stood up and walked to the window, looking at the base where Sarah Miller quietly conducted medical training, bearing the weight of a history that most people would never know. Colonel, does she know that we have uncovered her identity? Not yet, Hayes replied. But General Stone informed me that the Pentagon is concerned about operational security. If Sarah's identity becomes widely known, it could compromise other personnel who are still operating under similar protection. Gunny pulled printed documents from his database search. "Sir, what do you want us to do with this information?" Several people on base have speculated about her past, and social media posts have circulated among the young soldiers. Hayes stood up and approached his secure communication console. "First, we will contain the information that has already leaked. Mac, I need you to identify anyone who might have had access to the classified details of Captain Miller's service. Ganny, work with the base communications officer to track and remove any social media content that could compromise operational security." "What about Captain Miller herself? Does she need to be informed that her cover has been blown?" "I will meet with her first thing tomorrow morning," Hayes replied. "General Stone is flying in from the Pentagon to discuss the situation directly." Depending on how widely the information had spread, Captain Miller might need to be relocated for her own safety. The seriousness of the situation engulfed the four men as they realized their discovery had consequences that extended far beyond Fort Redemption. Sarah Miller was not just a contractor whose past had been uncovered. She was a classified asset, and her exposure could have ramifications that affected the entire special operations community. "Gentlemen," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, "until further notice, this information is compartmentalized. You will not discuss the identity of Captain Miller with anyone outside this room. Any questions or concerns must be directed to me immediately." As the meeting concluded and the three men prepared to leave, Hayes returned to his desk and the classified file that had altered his understanding of the woman who quietly trained his medics. The Pentagon had entrusted Fort Redemption with the protection of someone whose actions had already saved more lives than most could imagine. And now, the base's ability to maintain that protection was being tested. In her quarters across the base, Sarah Miller was unaware that her carefully maintained civilian identity had been uncovered by several people working independently of one another. She was reviewing training notes for medical scenarios for the next day, focused on preparing lessons that would help young medics develop skills they might need in combat situations. The irony was not lost on Colonel Hayes as he locked the classified documents in his office safe. Sarah Miller had come to Fort Redemption to share her knowledge with the next generation of combat medics. But it was that very expertise that made her such an effective instructor that also revealed her identity to those who understood the significance of what they had seen. The next day would bring new challenges as the base command sought to balance Sarah's security needs with the operational requirements of military training. But tonight, Fort Redemption was home to a legend whose story had been hidden for over a decade. A woman whose actions one day in Harabistan earned her a place in the classified annals of military heroism. The ghost of the canyon was no longer just a legend whispered among the special operations staff. She was Sarah Miller, a civilian contractor quietly sitting in temporary quarters, reviewing lesson plans that would help prepare young soldiers for the realities of combat medicine. The task now was to protect her identity, allowing her to continue the mission that had brought her back to military service, ensuring that the next generation of medics was ready to save lives when it mattered most. The morning briefing at Fort Redemption at 6 o'clock felt different, charged with a hidden tension that had nothing to do with routine military operations. Sarah Miller sat across from Colonel Daniel Hayes, her posture relaxed yet attentive as she awaited what she was told was an urgent meeting regarding her training contract. She was dressed in her standard civilian contractor attire, khaki pants and a collared shirt, but something in the colonel's demeanor suggested that this conversation would extend far beyond ordinary administrative matters. Major General Evelyn Stone entered the briefing room with the swift efficiency that characterized her approach to all professional interactions. At 52, she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who had navigated the highest levels of military command, and her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere from administrative routine to something approaching an official hearing. Sarah sensed the gravity of the moment even before introductions were made. "Captain Miller," General Stone said, sitting directly across from Sarah and using the military title that had been carefully omitted from all official reports from Fort Redemption. "I believe it's time for us to have an honest conversation about why you are really here." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied moments when her carefully constructed civilian persona began to crumble. She had anticipated that this day might come, but the directness of General Stone's approach suggested that the revelation of her past had been more thorough than she had assumed. "General, I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah replied, maintaining her contractor's civilian identity even as she realized the futility of the pretense. "I'm here on contract to provide support in medical training as authorized by Sergeant Major Rodriguez."